She was 21 years old and utterly alone the week she buried her mother, left with nothing but a small chest of keepsakes and a debt collector's patience running thin behind her. Her mother's own brother, a hard, calculating man named Silas Pruitt, had control of the family's remaining land, and it was he who told her plainly that a niece with no husband and no claim in writing had no right to linger on property that would soon be his to sell. With $11 sewn into her petticoat and a folded letter she had found tucked inside her mother's Bible, she used every remaining cent to buy back a forgotten, overgrown parcel of pine forest at the edge of Cedar Hollow, Georgia, land so poor and so far from any road that even her own uncle had laughed at her for wanting it. The letter marked a single spot deep in those pines, a place her mother had never once spoken of in life, where Eleanor found, half buried beneath a century of fallen needles, a well sealed shut with stone and iron, and no word anywhere as to why. What waited beneath that sealed well would not only restore everything she had lost, but would return to an entire forgotten community, a truth buried far longer than the well itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Vance. If you've ever carried a letter from someone you loved, one that seemed to be leading you somewhere without ever quite explaining where, tell us about it in the comments. And if you find yourself drawn to stories about old secrets and quiet restoration, we'd love to have you stay with us. Follow or subscribe to the channel so you don't miss where a story like Eleanor's leads. Eleanor Vance had grown up in the piney hill country of northern Georgia, in a modest cabin some 2 miles outside the small crossroads town of Cedar Hollow, raised largely by her mother, Constance Vance, a woman whose quiet steadiness Eleanor had never fully appreciated until she was old enough to understand how much steadiness it must have taken to raise a daughter alone in a place where widows were watched carefully and judged easily. Eleanor's father had died in a logging accident when she was only 4, crushed beneath a felled pine in the very forests that surrounded their home, and Constance had never remarried, choosing instead to support herself and her daughter through the one skill she possessed in true abundance, which was an uncommon knowledge of the healing properties of the plants and roots that grew wild throughout those hill country woods. Constance Vance was known, up and down the valley, as a woman who could be trusted with a fevered child or a difficult birth when the nearest proper doctor was half a day's ride away. And she had taught Eleanor everything she knew from the time the girl could first walk steadily enough to follow her into the woods, showing her which barks eased a cough and which roots, properly prepared, could bring down a dangerous fever, teaching her to read the forest the way some mothers taught their daughters to read scripture, with patience, reverence, and the understanding that its lessons could not be rushed. Eleanor grew into a young woman who moved through the pine forests around Cedar Hollow, with an ease that unsettled some of the more superstitious townsfolk, who whispered that the Vance women had some unnatural closeness to the woods, though most who knew Constance personally understood her gift simply as decades of careful, humble attention, rather than anything approaching magic. It was not only herbcraft that Constance passed down to her daughter, but a particular kind of moral steadiness that Eleanor would only fully understand the value of once she had lost everything else. Constance had a habit, whenever some family in the valley fell into hardship, whether from a poor harvest or a husband's untimely death or simple bad luck, of quietly bringing whatever she could spare, a jar of preserves, a poultice for a sick child, sometimes simply her presence and her steady hands, without ever expecting thanks or repayment in return. She used to tell Eleanor, kneeling together over some patch of wild ginger or slippery elm, that the forest gave freely to whoever understood how to receive it properly, and that people, she believed, ought to try to do the same for one another, freely and without keeping too careful an account of what was owed. Eleanor's uncle, Silas Pruitt, was Constance's own younger brother, a man who had left Cedar Hollow as a young man to make his fortune trading in timber rights further south, and who had returned some years later considerably wealthier and considerably harder than the brother Constance remembered from their shared childhood. Silas had never approved of his sister's chosen life, considering her herbcraft an undignified trade for a woman of their family's standing. And he had made it plain, on his infrequent visits to Cedar Hollow, that he thought Constance ought to have remarried, rather than raise a daughter alone on what little income her country doctoring provided. Constance, for her part, had always received her brother's visits with a patient, unbothered warmth that Eleanor, as a girl, mistook for genuine affection between them. Not yet old enough to see the careful distance her mother maintained, nor to understand why Constance never once, in all the years Eleanor could remember, mentioned a small parcel of pine forest that the family had apparently owned for generations, several miles deeper into the hills than their own modest cabin. Land that sat entirely unused and entirely unmentioned throughout Eleanor's whole childhood. Constance Vance's health began to decline in the winter of 1898, a slow failing of the heart that she recognized in herself with the same clear-eyed practicality she had always brought to diagnosing others. And she spent the last months of her illness quietly setting her affairs in order. Though Eleanor, absorbed in the exhausting work of nursing her mother through that final winter, did not think closely at the time about exactly what those affairs might include. Constance died in the early spring of 1899, with Eleanor at her bedside, and among her final coherent words to her daughter, spoken so softly that Eleanor was never entirely certain afterward whether she had heard them correctly, was a single instruction to look inside the old family Bible. In the back pages where the family records were kept, should she ever find herself in true need and unable to think of anywhere else to turn. Eleanor buried her mother in the small churchyard cemetery in Cedar Hollow, standing largely alone at the graveside, since Constance's herbcraft, however respected, had never translated into the kind of deep social belonging that brought a crowd of mourners. And it was in the numb, disoriented days that followed, before Eleanor had even fully absorbed the shape of her own grief, that Silas Pruitt arrived from his home 2 counties over to settle what he called, with brisk efficiency, the practical matters of his sister's estate. The cabin and its small surrounding acreage, Silas informed his niece, had in fact been deeded jointly to himself and Constance by their own father decades before, an arrangement Eleanor had never known existed, made at a time when their father had wished to ensure his daughter would always have a male relative's oversight in matters of property, since a widow alone, in that era's thinking, was considered unable to properly manage land on her own. With Constance now dead, Silas explained, his own claim to the property became sole and complete, and while he expressed, in the same brisk tone, a willingness to let Eleanor remain in the cabin through the following month out of family courtesy, he made it equally clear that he intended to sell the land soon after, since he had no personal use for a remote hill country cabin and no particular sentiment attached to keeping it in the family beyond what basic decency required. Eleanor, still raw with grief and entirely unprepared to contest a legal arrangement she had never known about until the moment it was used against her, found herself, within a month of her mother's death, packing what little she could carry into a single traveling chest, largely keepsakes and clothing, while Silas made arrangements to sell the cabin and its land to a timber concern eager to clear the acreage for lumber. She had, by the time she finally left the only home she had ever known, exactly $11 to her name. Money her mother had quietly saved over years from her herbcraft earnings and left, in a small tin, specifically labeled for Eleanor's use, the only inheritance Silas had not thought to claim as his own, since he considered it too small a sum worth the trouble of contesting. It was in those final days of packing, sorting through her mother's few belongings with the particular tenderness of a daughter trying to hold on to whatever remained of a person she had loved. That Eleanor finally remembered her mother's last coherent instruction and opened the family Bible to its back pages where the old records were kept. Tucked between the yellowed pages recording births and deaths going back 3 generations, she found a letter in her mother's own careful hand, dated only weeks before her death, addressed simply to my Eleanor, should you ever need it. The letter was not long, and it did not explain itself fully, which was, Eleanor would come to understand, entirely in keeping with her mother's cautious nature. It told Eleanor that the family had once owned a second parcel of land, separate from the cabin acreage Silas now controlled, a stand of old pine forest some 3 miles further into the hills, land that Constance's own grandmother had specifically set aside, generations before, outside the usual family inheritance, and that had passed. Through a quirk of an old will, Constance had only discovered herself as a young woman, to the Vance women specifically, rather than to the family's male line. The letter gave careful directions to a particular spot within that forest, describing landmarks, a split oak, a creek bend, a particular outcropping of gray stone, and told Eleanor only that she would find there something Constance had chosen, for reasons the letter did not explain, to leave sealed and undisturbed throughout her own lifetime, trusting that whatever need eventually drove Eleanor to seek it out would also grant her the wisdom to use it rightly. Eleanor read that letter perhaps a dozen times in the days that followed, turning over in her mind why her mother, a woman who told her everything else about the forest and its uses, had kept this one parcel of land entirely secret for the whole of Eleanor's childhood. She made inquiries, carefully and without revealing too much, at the county land office in the neighboring town, and confirmed what the letter suggested, that a modest parcel of forest land, recorded under an old deed bearing her great-grandmother's maiden name rather than the Vance family name Silas controlled, sat entirely separate from the cabin acreage, its taxes, remarkably, having been quietly paid every year by Constance herself, in cash, without ever registering the land under any name that would have drawn her brother's attention to its existence. The clerk informed her that the back taxes and transfer fee to formally claim the parcel in her own name would come to almost exactly $11, the precise sum her mother had left her. Eleanor paid it without hesitation, feeling for the first time since her mother's death something other than grief, a small, quiet flicker of purpose, and she left the land office the legal owner of 300 acres of pine forest that no one in Cedar Hollow, save perhaps her uncle, seemed to remember existed at all. When she mentioned the parcel briefly to old Mrs. Doyle, who ran the boarding house where Eleanor took a room for what few nights her diminished funds could afford, the older woman's face went thoughtful and a little wary, and she said only that folks used to call that stretch of forest the Quiet Woods, back when she herself was a girl, on account of some trouble there so old that most people had long since forgotten what the trouble had even been, only that it was best left alone. Eleanor walked the 3 miles into that forest the following morning, with her mother's letter folded carefully in her pocket, and nothing else to guide her but the landmarks Constance had described. And she found, exactly as the letter promised, the split oak, the creek bend, and finally the gray stone outcropping, half swallowed by decades of undergrowth, standing at the edge of a small clearing that felt, even in broad daylight, unusually still, as though the forest itself had grown quieter around that one particular spot out of some old habit it could no longer explain. It took her the better part of that first day, working with a borrowed hatchet and her bare hands, to clear away enough of the brush and fallen needles to reveal what her mother's letter had led her to. And when she finally uncovered it fully, she found herself staring at an old stone well, its mouth sealed completely with a heavy timber cap bound in iron, the whole assembly clearly built with considerable deliberate effort rather than simple neglect, as though someone, long ago, had gone to real trouble to ensure that whatever lay beneath that seal would not easily be disturbed. There was no marker, no inscription, nothing at all to explain why a perfectly good well, in a forest otherwise unremarkable, had been so carefully and permanently closed. She did not manage to open the seal that first day, lacking proper tools for a task clearly built to resist casual curiosity. And she returned to Mrs. Doyle's boarding house that evening, with her hands blistered, and her mind turning over every possible explanation her imagination could supply, none of which felt fully adequate to the careful deliberateness of what she had found. It took her nearly a week of careful, patient labor, borrowing tools from a sympathetic blacksmith in town who asked no questions she was not yet ready to answer, before she finally worked the iron bindings loose and lifted away the heavy timber cap, revealing a well shaft that descended perhaps 20 feet into cool, dry darkness, dry because, as she discovered lowering a lantern carefully on a rope, the well had clearly never held water at all. Its bottom lined not with the mud and stone of a natural spring, but with carefully fitted brick, built, she realized with a growing chill of understanding, not as a well in truth, but as something else entirely, disguised as one. Descending carefully into that dry shaft by rope and lantern light, Eleanor found at its base a small chamber, dry and undisturbed, containing a single iron-bound chest and, resting atop it, a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived decades untouched by damp or vermin. Opening the papers first, by lantern light in that strange underground quiet, Eleanor found herself reading her own great-grandmother's hand. A woman named Sarah Vance, who had, according to the paper's careful account, been a free woman of color who had married into the Vance family in the years just before the war. At a time and in a place where such a marriage carried real danger for both parties involved, and who had used this very well, disguised deliberately as an ordinary dry well rather than any obvious hiding place, as a station along a hidden route helping enslaved people move north to freedom in the years before emancipation finally came. The papers detailed, in Sarah Vance's careful hand, the names of some 30 individuals who had passed through that hidden chamber over the years before the war's end, sheltered briefly before continuing their journey north, along with a small collection of personal tokens left behind by several of them. A carved wooden button, a small Bible page, a woman's hairpin, items Sarah had apparently kept and recorded with the quiet hope that someday, somehow, these fragments might help reunite scattered families torn apart by the very system those travelers had been fleeing. The chest beneath the papers held a modest but genuine sum in old gold coin, savings Sarah Vance had apparently set aside over years, intended, a final note explained, to fund exactly this kind of reunification effort should any of her own descendants ever find the courage and occasion to take up the work she herself had grown too old and too watched to continue safely. Eleanor sat in that underground chamber for a long while, the lantern burning low, understanding all at once why her mother had kept this parcel entirely separate and entirely secret from the rest of the family's holdings, and why Constance had never spoken of it even to her own daughter until the final letter that led her here. Silas Pruitt, Eleanor understood with sudden, sharp clarity, was exactly the kind of man who would have seen this discovery, had he ever found it himself, as either a scandal to be buried more deeply than the well itself, or as a curiosity to be sold off for whatever price collectors might pay for such relics, without any regard for the actual living descendants of the people whose names filled Sarah Vance's careful pages. Constance, understanding her brother's nature far better than Eleanor had as a child, had simply kept the land and its secret entirely outside his reach, waiting, perhaps, for a daughter she trusted to eventually inherit both the knowledge and the responsibility that came with it. Eleanor returned to Cedar Hollow with the papers and coin carefully secured, and spent the following weeks in careful, deliberate research, writing letters to church registries and freedmen's aid societies in the towns Sarah Vance's route had apparently led toward, trying to trace whether any of the names recorded in those old pages might correspond to families still living. Families who might have spent decades wondering what had become of relatives who vanished north during the war years without ever sending word of where they had settled or what had become of them. It was slow, uncertain work, made harder by the passage of nearly 40 years and the scattering of records that such turbulent times inevitably produced. But Eleanor found, in that patient correspondence, a genuine echo of the same careful, unhurried attentiveness her mother had once taught her over patches of wild ginger in the forest, the understanding that some things could not be rushed, only tended faithfully until they revealed themselves in their own proper time. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Cedar Hollow, that word eventually reached Silas Pruitt that his niece had been asking unusual questions and corresponding with distant church registries about matters connected to the old Quiet Woods parcel. Land he had not thought about in years and had certainly never known contained anything of value. He arrived at Mrs. Doyle's boarding house one afternoon in early summer, considerably less brisk in manner than he had been at their previous meeting, and informed Eleanor that whatever she believed she had found on that land legally belonged, in his estimation, to the broader Vance family estate, since the original separation of that parcel from the main family holdings had never been properly documented in any will he considered binding, and he suggested, not quite as a threat but not far from one either, that she would be wise to share with him fully whatever she had discovered before matters became legally complicated for a young woman with no resources to fight a protracted claim. Eleanor, who had spent enough of her recent months reading her own great-grandmother's careful, courageous hand to have absorbed something of Sarah Vance's quiet steadiness, told her uncle plainly that the deed recorded at the county land office named the parcel's ownership clearly through the female line of the family, a fact he could verify himself at the courthouse if he doubted her, and that whatever she had found on that land she intended to use not for her own private gain, but to attempt something she believed her great-grandmother would have wanted, which was to see whether any of the names in Sarah Vance's old records might still have living family somewhere, waiting, even after all these years, for some word of what had become of a relative lost to the chaos of that era. Silas left that meeting angrier than he had arrived, and in the weeks that followed, Eleanor felt the particular pressure a man of his standing could bring to bear on a young woman without protection. He spoke to the county clerk and questioned, without real basis, whether the old deed's transfer to Eleanor had been properly conducted. He mentioned, to anyone in Cedar Hollow who would listen, that his niece had grown strange in her grief, chasing old ghost stories in the quiet woods, rather than settling sensibly into whatever modest life a woman in her position ought to expect. He even suggested, to the timber concern that had purchased his cabin acreage, that the adjoining parcel might soon become available as well, hoping perhaps to force Eleanor's hand through simple financial pressure if legal challenge proved unsuccessful. But Eleanor had by then found an unexpected ally in Reverend Josiah Cade, the pastor of Cedar Hollow's small Baptist congregation, who had connections through his own denomination's network to churches further north, that had long kept careful records of formerly enslaved families and their descendants, precisely because so many congregations had spent decades quietly helping families search for relatives scattered by the war. Reverend Cade, upon hearing Eleanor's account and examining Sarah Vance's careful old papers himself, offered to help her correspond more effectively through his church's established channels. And it was through this partnership, patient and unhurried across the better part of a year, that Eleanor finally began to receive replies, The first confirmed match came in the autumn of 1899. A family in Ohio named Freeman, who had passed down, across 3 generations, a story of a great-great-grandmother who had traveled north as a young woman through Georgia's hill country with the help of a woman she remembered only as Mrs. Sarah, and who had kept, all those years, a small carved wooden button she said Mrs. Sarah had given her as a token of remembrance, a button that matched precisely the description in Sarah Vance's own careful ledger. More letters followed in the months after, and more matches, some families still holding fragments of the story passed down through their own oral history, others entirely unaware, until Eleanor's letter arrived that any record of their ancestors' journey had survived at all, and Eleanor found herself, in the writing and receiving of those letters, doing work that felt less like unearthing old scandal, and more like completing something her great-grandmother had begun, and her own mother had faithfully protected, waiting only for the right hands to finish it. Silas Pruitt's opposition crumbled not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the same slow accumulation of plain truth that had settled matters before in families like Eleanor's own. Reverend Cade, once he understood the full shape of what Eleanor had uncovered, spoke of it carefully from his own pulpit, framing it not as scandal, but as a quiet act of courage performed by a woman in the Vance family decades before. And Cedar Hollow, hearing the story told this way, began to regard Eleanor not as a strange young woman chasing ghost stories, but as the keeper of something the whole community, without quite knowing it, had reason to be proud of. Silas found, within the year, that his standing in Cedar Hollow had shifted in ways money alone could not repair, and he quietly withdrew his objections to Eleanor's deed once it became clear that continuing to press the matter publicly would only further expose his own indifference to what his niece had accomplished. Eleanor used the gold coin Sarah Vance had left, not for her own comfort, though she certainly could have used it, but to fund the travel and correspondence needed to bring several of the Freeman family and others like them to Cedar Hollow itself, standing at last at the very well their ancestor had once sheltered within, closing a circle that had been left open for nearly 4 decades. She used what remained to help repair the small Baptist church that had assisted her search, and to establish, with Reverend Cade's help, a small fund to continue the work of tracing other families whose histories had been scattered by that same terrible era. Work that continued in Cedar Hollow for years afterward. Long after Eleanor herself had settled quietly into the old family cabin, which she eventually reclaimed once Silas's standing had diminished enough that he no longer had the will to contest her return. And so we come back to where we began, to a young woman of 21, grieving and nearly penniless, following a letter into a forest that held nothing anyone else believed was worth finding. Eleanor Vance never once regretted following her mother's careful, quiet instructions into the quiet woods, because what waited beneath that sealed well was never treasure in the ordinary sense, but something far more valuable, a courage kept faithfully hidden across 2 generations of women who understood that some truths need protecting until the proper hands are ready to carry them forward. She learned, in that patient unsealing, exactly what her mother had always tried to teach her among the roots and barks of that same forest, that the most important things are rarely announced loudly, and that patience, tenderly kept, eventually reveals exactly what it was always meant to. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Eleanor Vance, and with the sealed well that held far more than anyone in Cedar Hollow ever imagined. If this story moved you, we would love to hear in the comments about a time an old letter, an old object, or an old story from your own family turned out to mean more than anyone expected. And we would be grateful if you shared this story with someone who believes, as we do, that the quietest inheritances are often the ones most worth honoring. We'll leave you tonight with the question Eleanor herself carried out of that forest. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? Until next time, stay close.